Can you guys hear me okay? How you doing? All right, so thanks, Elizabeth. And thanks for having me out, you guys, because when Theo first contacted me to do this, I was really excited because the way that he described the work that you all do in cultivation sounds like you do a lot of the type of work that I'm really interested in understanding. Okay, so I study teams. I study teams of people comprised of individuals who have differing expertise from one another. And I'm really interested in this notion, and it's kind of an old notion, that if we combine kind of our expertise, there's this potential for us to do things that are more innovative or interesting than we could do on our own. I'm also really interested, and this is kind of going to be the subject of my talk today, in how people who are good at building these sorts of relationships, what do they do that allows them to overcome the serious challenges that teams like this face? So that's going to be the overarching question for my talk today, which is, what do we know? We have a ton of social science looking at teams and organizations, and so I'm going to try and give you a brief overview about the benefits that are associated with kind of building interdisciplinary relationships, some of the challenges that people face as they seek to develop these relationships, and the strategies that we might build if we understand these challenges that people build. Simple talk. It's got 3 parts. So first part's going to be talking about the benefits. Why is this a thing we want to do, right? What are the unique challenges we face? Spoiler, they'll have to do with communication. I'm a communication professor. It's what I do. But then we're going to talk about how, if you understand the communication challenges, how might you think about building strategies differently than the way that a lot of people do? What are the mistakes that organizations make when they don't understand the challenges that they're facing? So let's get started. Anybody know who this is? Thomas Edison? Yeah, Thomas Edison, right? What did Thomas Edison do? Lots of stuff. The easy answer is he invented the light bulb, right? Right? This is the guy behind the image that we have of innovation, inspiration, where you have the light bulb appear over your head. This is Thomas Edison, okay? Edison didn't just invent the light bulb, he invented a ton of stuff, I believe was the term for the audience, right? Over his lifetime, he produced 1,093 patents. That's a lot, even by today's standards, and he's doing this in the late 1800s, okay? Here are a couple. These are pictures from the patents themselves. So he invented early telegraphy technologies, the phonograph, the light bulb, the one we know him most for. In the early 20th century, he was working on movie cameras, stuff like that. So Edison, in many ways, is the embodiment of pretty much everything I want to talk about today, right? And the reason for this is that there are some misconceptions in the ways that the public talks about someone like Thomas Edison, okay? And there's a lot wrong with this picture. So, and there's a lot wrong with this idea of the light bulb popping on over your head, okay? And the reason is that when we talk about innovation and invention, right, we talk about it as something that just happens. As a spur of a moment. It's a magical thing, and it's often done by a person. And this person who is a genius, who's really smart, and they just have this innate magical characteristic that allows them to come up with this cool new invention, right? When you really look at how someone like Edison worked, though, that's not what he did. Edison was a very smart dude, right? But what actually gave Edison his advantage was this place. Okay, does anybody know what this is? This is Thomas Edison's lab in Menlo Park, New Jersey. Okay. So Edison was ahead of his time. And so what he realized was that, you know, invention really actually isn't about making something completely new. It's about combining pre-existing ideas in a way that nobody's thought of before. And in fact, the light bulb wasn't new. The idea of making light with a filament, a charged filament, was around since the early 1800s. The idea of a vacuum bulb that to kind of make the filament last longer was around for like 20 years before he got his patent on it, right? What Edison did was build the first commercially feasible light bulb and get the patent on that. And he didn't do it alone, okay? So in this lab, he hired a ton of really diverse people and got them on his payroll. You can visit this place. It's preserved at the Henry Ford Museum in Detroit, Michigan. If you're ever there, I highly recommend going to check it out. 2 floors. Second floor, we've got scientists. We've got chemists. We've got material scientists. We've got engineers, right? People who can build stuff and know a lot about building weird, different things. And they're all working on all of these projects in the same room with each other. Like, this is messy, full of test tubes. It's exactly what you imagine a mad scientist lab would look like. Okay? First floor, we have manufacturers, people who can build prototypes of these ideas that the folks upstairs are building right away, rapidly. Check and see if the idea works. Okay? In the building next door, they've got patent lawyers, and they've got PR professionals. Sound like something that may be similar to you, right? He's building an archetype of what becomes the modern organization in the mid to late 20th century, right? And so if you look at this, it kind of demystifies this process by which innovation happens, okay? So this is why I think we should care about this, right? Is part of what I'm trying to get us to think about today is thinking beyond this light bulb and thinking more about what is it that makes a place like Edison's Menlo Park laboratory work. And the reason for that is if all we do is look at the light bulb and think about the outcomes, we miss the process underneath. And we're often, if we don't understand that process, we're more likely to get it wrong. That's the narrative about it. Okay? So that's kind of justification one for the talk. Second justification is that this type of organizational form is something that's increasingly common. So question, raise your hand if your job involves you routinely interacting with people who have different knowledge or expertise from yourselves. Raise them high. Okay, that's interesting, right? Also not a surprise, kind of a loaded question, given what you guys do, right? So one way to explain this might be that cultivation is a process that requires you to engage with people from different disciplines to get your job done, okay? But the other aspect, and the reason why no matter where I ask this question, I get a very similar amount of hands raised, is that this type of requirement, this is increasingly common in modern organizations. As organizations went online in the 80s and 90s, as we shifted to building more information goods as opposed to products as being the standard ways that organizations make profit, the need for us to be innovative, to adapt, has led to organizations wanting to reproduce structures like this laboratory. Okay? And there's good reason for this. So now we're getting to the benefits of here, right? What is it that having a relationship with someone who knows things you don't does? It can do a ton of things, right? So it gets you faster access to new information. If I have connections with people that nobody else around me has connections to, and they hear a good idea, I'm going to be able to pull that into my world first. So that's going to be good. It's going to give you an advantage there. It's going to get you an access to a wider array of knowledge, right? So if I'm a material scientist but I don't know anything about vacuum tubes, if I know someone who knows stuff about vacuum tubes, I now can like pull their idea in with mine. So this possibility of combination is wider than it was before. And finally, you get access to material resources, right? So people situated in different places have access to money is the easiest one, right? But information is increasingly a really valuable resource that organizations are interested in managing by having these sorts of relationships. And it's by combining these unique sources of information that you can accomplish these first two goals. Okay, so this is all well and good. I've made an argument, but do we have any data to back this up? And luckily, this has been the subject of research in social sciences for the better part of 2 to 3 decades, right? One of what I think is the most compelling sets of evidence to support this comes out of an area of research called social network analysis. When I'm talking about social network analysis, I'm not talking about Facebook or LinkedIn. I'm talking about looking at naturally occurring human social relationships, okay? I'm not going to give you a big lecture on how we do this, but you need to know a little bit about the way the methods work to understand the way that the findings happen, okay? Essentially, what people do in this space is they'll go into an organization and they'll say, who do you talk to? Give me a list of the names. Okay, great. The next person, who do you talk to? Give me a list of all the names that you talk to on a regular basis. If you ask enough people within an organization and you link them together, you can come up with a map of what day-to-day communication looks like within that space. And you start to see when you build these maps, you start to see some really interesting structures. So this is a criminally small chart, I apologize, but you don't need to know the details. But this is the sort of map that you come up with. Right? So you've got here, the numbers are people, and the lines connecting them say that they communicate with each other on a regular basis. So when you look at a chart like this, a couple of features might jump out to you right off the bat. The first is that not everybody talks to everybody else, which turns out to be quite important. Right? And in fact, there are these gaps between clustered areas of connection within this organization. Okay? We call these structural holes. Or at least that's what Ron Burt, the guy whose research that I'm talking about right now, he's a professor at the University of Chicago, calls these things. And you can think of a number of reasons why we would have these isolated clusters that were separated from people within a social network. You're on a work team together. You're in a local office, right? Maybe you work in separate organizations, right? All of these are reasons why you would communicate more within a small cohort of people and not without of it. So Bert, and this is where he starts to get really kind of clever, is he says, well, if these structural holes are present, and they're there because they're kind of capturing this differing positions within the organization, it's reasonable to assume that there's going to be differing knowledge in each of these clusters of people. And that if we buy this argument that innovation comes from connecting different bodies of knowledge, maybe people who sit across these boundaries, boundary spanners, we call them, so I've got them circled here, right? Who have social connections that are the bridges between these clustered areas in the network, maybe those people are going to be interesting for a number of reasons. Okay? So he goes out, he measures these networks, and he looks to see if your network looks like this. He has a measure he calls constraint, which again, we can talk about the math offline if it's something you're interested in. But basically, you have an unconstrained network if you're brokering a lot of connections. You have a constrained network if all of your connections talk to each other. So you're in kind of an echo chamber. And what he shows, this is a chart that's summarizing findings from 6 different organizations, looking at 4 different types of performance metrics, is the following. So to the left are people that have highly unconstrained networks. These are the brokers. To the right are people who are constrained. On the y-axis is performance. Okay? So what this chart is showing, which I'll tell you in more specifics in a minute, is that we have pretty compelling data to suggest that people who are brokers do better on a number of different metrics of performance. What sorts of metrics, Will? I'll tell you. So a number of really cool things. The first one that I like is that they're more likely to have good ideas. I think this is crazy, right? So one of the studies looks at kind of suggestions and projects, proposed projects by people in the organization, and what they show, and they have them rated by managers as, is this something that is innovative or different from what we've been doing in the past? Is it something that's going to provide profit to our organization? And there's a strong, significant statistical effect for people who are brokers to come up with ideas that are rated better in terms of getting stuff done. Okay? Here's one that may motivate you a little bit more. People who are brokers tend to get paid more. Controlling for position within the organization, controlling for how long you've worked there, for all these things, above and beyond all of these signals, people who sit at structural holes and cross them tend to get paid more within organizations. They're also more likely to get promoted. Okay? It's kind of weird. They're also more likely to be able to find jobs if they want to. This is a classic finding in social networks research. People who have broad networks can reach out and find opportunities more readily than people who are more insulated within their networks. Okay? We don't just have social network stuff, though. We have research in other spaces. So one of my other favorite studies, I do a lot of research on scientists and scientific teams because there are really clear disciplinary boundaries in this space. But there's some really interesting research that looks at what are the qualities that make a research paper that's likely to be the most influentially cited paper for a given year. Really interesting study shows that papers that have authors who are drawing upon multiple fields, increasingly over the past 10 years, are much more likely to be the ones who make it to the top of the pile in terms of citations. Let's look at patents. So another one of my favorite studies does analysis of 35,000 patents over 30 years. It's a lot of big data set, right? And what they show is that patents that have co-authors who have differing areas of expertise, they're more likely to produce novel patents. And what I mean by novel patents means is that they're combining ideas, like Edison, that maybe have existed before, but that have never co-occurred within the same patent before. Sounds cool, right? So what I'm hoping you're getting here, right, is there seems to be a pretty strong signal that there's some benefit to be affiliated with kind of building these cross-boundary relationships in organizations, whether those be formal organizations, university organizations, between organizations, right, thinking about access to new knowledge. So the next question that drives me is, why in the world are we all doing this? Right? If this is such a strong factor, right, why is it that there are still people within that organization who are siloed among themselves? So now what I would shift to now, the answer to the question, in short, is that it's really hard. And in fact, you see stuff like this. I don't know if you guys read the Business Review and stuff like that, but if you read about this sort of stuff in the press, you actually see kind of this dual conversation. where one side's like, we need to collaborate more, we need to connect, connecting is great, and the other side is we're connecting too much, it's so tiring, I want to have a life outside of the office, right? And there's compelling evidence for both sides, okay? So, for instance, we know that teams comprised of individuals who have differing expertise, they encounter all sorts of really kind of undesirable things. So they're more likely to have conflict. They're more likely to get in fights with one another. They have higher coordination costs. They take longer to get their jobs done than teams comprised of individuals who have similar expertise. And they also have higher rates of failure. This is something that I think is often lost in these kind of very positive stories about interdisciplinarity that we see in the public press, is that it's a high-risk, high-reward effort. Okay? Beyond this, we increasingly see statements, words like this. Collaboration overload, collaborative overload, right? This is this idea that my boss is asking me to make so many new connections that I can't even get my job done, right? One of the studies that I like that talks about this did a survey of a couple giant organizations, found that workers reported spending 70 to 85% of their time just managing their communication with their peers, right? And so this has raised questions of, well, what's the right balance, right? If all I'm doing is managing these relationships, how am I getting any work done? So that's something we want to think about, right? So what the picture, as we're kind of developing this understanding of what's going on here, right? What I want you to take away at this point is the evidence we have from a bird's eye view is that building cross-boundary relationships seems like a cool thing, right? It creates this potential for benefit, but it's a high-risk, high-reward process. It's not easy. And in fact, you're going to encounter a number of challenges as you seek to build these relationships. Okay? And this is kind of getting more into my area, my own area of research. I go out to these teams that are trying to do this sort of relationship, and I look at what happens. Where do things break? And what are the people doing who actually succeed at this that allow them to overcome these sorts of barriers? And if you look in my own research and looking at the other research in this area, you can really kind of boil the types of challenges these teams face down to three things. Okay? The first is we speak different languages. Okay? Beyond that, communicating our ideas is often a lot harder than we think it is, and that can lead to problems. And finally, the fact that we have different knowledge often is a source of conflict, right? Because we're situated in different parts of an organization or in different organizations, we have different motives. And if we don't address those differences, we're going to fail. Okay, so let's dive in. So the first challenge, remember, is linguistic differences. And I'm going to show you a quote from a participant in one of my studies here. I'm just going to read it to you. One of the key characteristics is that there's this volumetric data, so spatially organized data in basically 3 dimensions. And then they do a fourth for time. Our discretization means that we need to abstract out the specific way that we conduct our simulations, and just another semantic layer that we need to abstract out between systems of code, and it means having to break down how does a geometry intersect with fluids. It's English, right? Any simulation and physicists in the room, right? So this person's talking about how you simulate the physics of the atmosphere. Right? And I have no clue what they're saying, or I didn't when they said this. I had to follow up and say, what, right? But hopefully this is evidence to you of the fact that even though we all are largely doing business in English, we really do have different languages when we're seeking to interact with people, particularly people who we're going to because they have different expertise from ourselves. Okay? So yeah, we have jargon, right? Another thing that organizations love are acronyms, right? Okay, so I worked for General Motors for a few years. I also did some research studying automobile engineering, looking at teams of engineers. And one of the things, I'm a social scientist, I'm not an engineer, right? So one of the first things that happens to me when I get into this organization that I'm studying is I'm going into these meetings with these engineers. And I'm sitting there and I'm like, wait, you guys are speaking in code. Like, how do you know all of these acronyms? Like I couldn't believe the number of acronyms that I was running into as I was sitting in on these meetings. So after this meeting, I walk up to a guy that I've started to kind of be friendly with. I feel comfortable kind of exposing my ignorance to, and I'm like, dude, how do you keep track of this, right? What do you do to keep track of all these things? He says, good, you asked the right person. Come back to my desk. So I go back to his desk, and he pulls up an Excel spreadsheet on his computer. And what he prints out for me, is 5 pages, single-spaced, 10-point font of acronyms. right? So let's see what I can remember here. Design and strategic intent, bill of materials, National Traffic and Safety Association. You get the idea, right? I don't even remember these now, right? So how in the world are we expecting ourselves to be able to build these relationships off the bat if we're literally speaking in code in these organizations? So you have to overcome this sort of barrier, even if you want to get to the potential of maybe even sharing knowledge. Okay? That's going to slow things down. But what really messes things up are actually the sneakily easier words. Okay? These ones are easy. If someone says an acronym, you can be like, I don't know what that means. Tell me what that means. Right? What happens, though, especially on diverse teams, is that people think they're saying something that the other person gets, but they don't. And in reality, the same word means very different things to different people. Okay? So a good example of this comes from my automobile engineers. To get this example, you need to know a little bit about how they design cars. Okay? Cars, very complex piece of technology composed of tens of thousands of different little parts that all need to be designed to fit together in a way that somehow miraculously is safe and drives you down the road. Okay? It takes years to build one of these things. And the way that organizations, like the ones that I've studied, do this is they hire an army of engineers. And these engineers specialize in different things. So you have frame and body engineers. These are engineers who are specialists in building the most fuel-efficient car possible. They know what you tweak to make sure this car is going to get its fuel economy standards and going to be sweet, and that's that way. Okay? We have noise and vibration engineers. These engineers specialize in making that quiet ride that lets your toddler sleep on that road trip and not get up and cry while you're going 70 miles an hour trying to get to Michigan before the end of nap time. Okay? The last group is safety and crash. It's fairly self-explanatory. These are the ones who are doing their best to make sure that when you get into that incident that you don't want to end up in, that you're going to be able to walk away from that crash, and that the person that you end up hitting is also going to be able to walk away from that crash. Okay. So the key thing is, right, these members of these different occupational groups are routinely going into meetings with each other. Right? We have cross-boundary communication going on. Right? And in these meetings, the one thing that they can all agree on is they all want to build the best car. Right? And they're talking about this all the time. Yeah, we've got to build the best car. We love this company. We want to make a car that's going to change the world. Right? But what they so often don't realize is that when they say best, they're really saying very different things from one another. This is largely tied to the knowledge that they're drawing. Right? So to a frame and body engineer, a best car is the most fuel-efficient car. Okay? To a noise and vibration engineer, it's the quietest. To a safety and crash engineer, it's the safest. And so oftentimes, these semantic differences can just lay latent for a very long period of time. In fact, until it's too late often to change and we're already deep into conflict and we're already too far down the road. Okay? Talk a little bit about that a little bit later. Here's another example. It's just a bridge, right? Okay, so this is another project I studied looking at people trying to build a tool to measure a city's resilience to disaster. And what they do is they say, hey, we're going to build this cross-disciplinary team. We're going to get urban planners. We're going to get engineers. We're going to get social scientists. We're going to all bring them into a room and figure out, they all think about communities, right? If all we could do is just get them to share their ideas with each other, we can come out with like the best measure for resilience possible. Okay? So they go in, they start these meetings, right? And they're like, okay, let's start somewhere easy. How do we figure out if a bridge is resilient or not, or important, right? If that gets washed out in a disaster, what's its likelihood of getting broken? What they quickly discover is the following. So to transportation engineers, a bridge is a transportation facilitator. They're interested in how many lanes it has, how many cars can travel on. From a structural engineer's point of view, that doesn't matter. It's how many spans does it have. Vulnerability is how it's broken. Social scientists' point of view is the bridge economically important? Does it disconnect disadvantaged districts from one another? Right? So something as seemingly simple off the bat as a bridge can actually be this really complicated artifact that we need to untangle if we want to have any hopes of collaborating with one another. Okay? So how do we do it? And this is kind of the rub, and this is the beginning of the place where we're going to build our strategies from. This is the same urban planner. It says the biggest mistake you can make is not to set up a regular rhythm of meeting. There's a lot of dead air at first, but after a while it picks up. You feel your way through the barriers and begin to develop a common language. You surprise each other because you end up having studied the same thing in different ways. In a good collaboration, each side is pushing each other, but you can't do that until you get to know each other. Right? The key here is time. The key here is communication and engagement and dialogue. Right? And this is the thing that we often overlook when we're building these relationships. is that it doesn't happen off the bat. What you get by building connection is an opportunity, but it's really going to take engagement to actually realize that potential. Okay? Let's talk about challenge. So the key findings here, right? Developing a common language takes time, right? And this is the one that I'm particularly keen on, is that these differences can last a ton longer than you think they would, right? They give you that list of acronyms, great, but you're going to find out 3 months down the line that you think that you've been studying the same thing and you really haven't. You're going to have to adapt. Okay. That's barrier 1. Barrier 2 has to do with communicating our knowledge. And so what we're going to do for this is play a game. We like games? Okay, let's play a game. All right, so here's the deal. There should be an envelope on each of your tables. The envelope should be marked do not open. Do not open that envelope yet, but we will be opening it in a second. Okay, so the name of the game is Tap a Tune. Okay? And what's going to happen when you open those envelopes is they're going to be little slips of paper. Okay, what I want you to do now is choose a partner. There may be an odd number at some tables. Go ahead and swap. If there's some triplets, that's fine too. So find a team. All right, so go ahead and open the envelope. You're going to take out the piece of paper. Do not show anybody else the piece of paper that you have. All right, do we all have our pieces of paper? Okay, here's the game. On your paper will be the name of a song. You should all know the song that's on your piece of paper. Your job is going to be to get your partner to guess the song that's on your piece of paper. But here's the trick. You can't talk, okay? There's no pantomiming, there's no charades, there's no humming, there's none of that stuff. All you can do is tap it. Tap here, you can clap. Those are the only mode of communication you're allowed to do, and I expect you all to police each other to make sure there's no cheating going on in the room. Okay. Cool. No other clues, no humming. Choose who's going to tap first. Each tapper will get 60 seconds to get their listener to guess, and then we'll swap. Okay? Any questions about the game? It's pretty straightforward. All right, go ahead. All right. Let's, I know, I'm sorry, maybe not all of you got a chance. All right. Let's bring it back. Okay, Barley. Why in the world are you having us tap songs to each other at a talk about communicating across boundaries? Okay? Let's figure it out. Okay, so here's my question. How did we do? I would love, okay, raise your hand if you were a tapper and your partner guessed your song. You guys did pretty good. Okay. Maybe like 40%, 50%, right? The songs that you had on your slips were not exactly tricky songs. My 2-year-old helped me choose them. But what's going on in this exercise, right?
Very distracting. Very distracting for everyone else to be talking.
All right. So, thank you. So what's going on with this, right? I have built a situation where you have access to unique knowledge, and you're trying to convey that knowledge to a partner. Okay? This is a vetted experimental paradigm. I've used a couple of times to varying success. You do much better than most people. That's probably because it's what you do for your jobs. But let's see how people do on this task in the lab, in a controlled setting, where I haven't given any clues about what song might be on there. You don't know the person you're talking to. People get 1 out of 40 songs right on this task. This is a really hard task, okay? Right? But that's actually, to me, is the less interesting part of the story. The more interesting part of the story is when you ask the people before they start tapping the song about how many songs they think their partner's going to guess right? They estimate it's going to be about 50%. Okay? And so this is the lesson, right? So what's going on in this task? Right? You're the tapper, you're hearing happy birthday in your head, and you're like, oh my gosh, this is like so obvious. Like, why aren't you getting this? Like, let me tap louder, right? Anybody have that experience? Yes? Okay, some people, right? If you are the listener, what's your response? You just keep clapping something. I have no clue in the world what you're doing right now, right? You clapping louder doesn't help me, and now I'm just getting frustrated. Okay. So this is reproducing what happens a lot of the time when you get like that physicist in the room trying to explain what they're doing to someone who's not a physicist, is that everybody gets frustrated. And the reason for it is this, is that we tend to overestimate how easy it is for us to share the knowledge that we have. What's going on as we're trying to explain to people what we know and why they should care about it is that we're hearing happy birthday in our head, and everything we're saying is making sense, right? Or we think it is, and they have no clue what in the world you're talking about, and then you ask them if they get it, and they're like, sure, because they don't want to embarrass you. Okay? Great example of this from a real-world context. Anybody know about the Xerox Alto? Exactly. The Xerox Alto is a very important computer in the history of computing. It was made by Xerox at Xerox PARC, Palo Alto Research Center. Xerox, do they make computers? They make copiers, right? Is how we know of them. One of the interesting things about Xerox as an organization is that throughout the 70s, the 80s, and most of the 90s, they ran this place in Palo Alto called the Palo Alto Research Center that was where many, many, many of the infrastructural elements that make up the internet were invented. Okay? Among the technologies that they made there was the Xerox Alto. This was a personal computer. This was a machine that was intended for use by a day-to-day user. It had a mouse. The mouse was just invented like 2 years before this. It had a keyboard, and it had a graphical user interface, a GUI, which is essentially a Windows platform, right? Before this, when you engage with computers, you're either using punch cards or you're typing in code to get stuff done. Okay? The Xerox Alto is ahead of its time. They bring this, the researchers in this, do you notice the date there, 73, right? That should sound super early to you guys. Okay. So they've got these researchers who are situated in the center of innovation in computers and technology, right? And they get it. They're like, man, PCs are going to be super cool. We could totally be ahead of this. And they take this idea, they take their prototype, they bring it to management, and they say, management, we can make $1 bajillion, we can be ahead of everything in the world, da 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 da. What does management say? What? We make copiers, and nobody's going to buy this. This is like pretty expensive, and who wants a computer in their house, right? You're in happy birthday in your head? Right? That's what's going on in this situation. This is what goes on when you've got that great idea. What we underestimate is the fact that the reason that we get that it's a good idea is often based upon this substrate of knowledge that we already have that the person we're trying to communicate with doesn't get. Coda to this story? You know who did copy the Xerox Alto? Steve Jobs. Much of the technology that went into building the first Macintosh was taken directly from the Alto. It was inspired by this, right? This was well known throughout the Silicon Valley that this technology existed, and there's books about kind of this flop and why it happened. Okay. But I think it demonstrates this challenge that I'm trying to get at, which is that it's pretty hard, and it's often harder than we think it is to get our point across when we don't share knowledge with the people that we have. Okay, third challenge, boundaries breed politics. Okay, so you find yourself in a situation. You have the beginnings of a collaboration. You both agree you want to build the best widget of whatever the thing that you want to do. You want to make amazing things happen. But what we often don't realize is that our stakes, the reason why we're there, can often lead us to conflict later on. Okay? So let's go back to my automobile engineers. We've already covered the fact that they have differing notions of what the best car is. We know they're going to have to resolve that over time in these meetings. But they start getting these kind of second-level problems when they start coming into these design meetings. So what happens in a design meeting is we'll have a part for the car, and you'll have noise and vibration, you'll have frame and body and safety engineers all in the same room, and they're all trying to make this part of the car the safest, quietest, and least loud part possible. Okay? What they end up doing is getting in these hour and multi-hour long fights about how you should design this part. And I'm talking about designs in sense of like, we need to make it 1/10 of a millimeter wider. This will be like an afternoon's meeting and like 3 weeks of work trying to fight over how to make this happen. And the reason for this is that not only do we have differing understandings of what the best car is, but how you go about doing that often leads to opposing ideals. So a little bit of an engineering lesson. Frame and body engineers, they want to make the most efficient car. How do we make a car more fuel efficient? One of the easiest ways to do that is to make it lighter. Okay? So in these meetings, they're often fighting to take mass out of a part. If you want to make a car quieter, how do we do that? We add isolation to the car. We pad it with all that insulation so that no sound's going to get in there. We make the beams that make up the car thicker so they don't vibrate and rattle your hands while you're driving it. Right? You're starting to see what's going to happen when these people start fighting with each other. Right? How about safety and crash? They're like on a league of their own. Right? They've got the way that you design a car to be safe is totally complex. Basically, what you're trying to do is build the engine compartment to crush really well, and you're trying to build the cage that you sit in effectively to be really stable so that the energy when you hit something kind of moves around you. Okay? And so they're like making thick, it's like from meeting to meeting, you don't know what side they're going to be on. Okay? Right? But this is the problem, right? Is that even if they realize they all have differing understandings of what the best car is, and they all agree they want to make the best car, because they have these differing objectives about what the best car should be, it leads to these really deep conflicts on these teams. Okay? And unless you realize that this is what's going on, and underlying this, and the teams that when I was studying this, that were able to resolve this were the ones that recognized that this was happening, and recognized that you maybe could be able to compromise by thinning out another part if you want to thick out this part, right? Call it log rolling in negotiations, okay? It's only if you realize and recognize that these different motivations are present that you can even try to build a strategy that might resolve it, okay? Another example. This is from some research I did looking at weather scientists, okay? So the folks that I were studying, they are kind of world-leading experts in building the computer models that predict the weather. These are the models that your evening weather forecaster is using to figure out if it's going to rain tomorrow. Okay? They're the ones that write that code. The cool thing about this particular group that I'm working with is that they've partnered with an energy company, cross-boundary communication, right? And what they say is, hey, we're really good at predicting the weather, right? And you know, wind farms, they rely on weather, right? Maybe we could like work together and find something cool going on with wind farms and weather prediction. And so Energy Co., which is my pseudonym for this the company, is like, sure, let's do this. You know, we actually really want to have wind prediction for the farms because if we know when it's going to be blowing, we know if our wind turbine is going to be actually making energy, and we can use that to do things like turn down our coal plant more efficiently, save everybody money, but more importantly, make ourselves a little bit more money. And so the weather scientists go out and they build this state-of-the-art weather forecasting system. This is a screenshot of what it looks like, right? And basically what it's showing is in the future, how much wind is there likely to be within this particular wind farm. And they're super excited about it. They've showed it to some of their colleagues. They win awards at conferences for how state-of-the-art this particular technology is. They bring it to the managers at the energy company, and this is what one of them said to me. If all the best science does that, pointing to the model, then the science sucks. You should be doing something different. Not what you expected, right? And this completely befuddles the weather scientists, because they're like, this is like leading cutting-edge science. This is the most accurate wind prediction system that has ever been made, right? And what ends up happening, they start talking, they're like, well, what's going on here, right? I thought we liked the wind, right? Well, it turns out that the energy company doesn't actually care about wind. They care about power. And so this is where their difference in values and motives lead to this conflict. The scientists, what they care about in building this weather model is understanding the atmosphere and building the most accurate representation of what they characterize as the weather as possible, right? The energy company doesn't really care about the wind, right? The energy company cares about is using their resources efficiently and making money. And so what they quickly discovered as they tried to use this model for their day-to-day operations was that wind is not that closely tied to energy production at a farm. There's all sorts of extenuating factors that can make a wind turbine make more or less energy with a 20-mile-an-hour wind. Okay? So it was only once the scientists and the energy company realized that they had these kind of parallel but slightly diverging objectives to deal with the model that they said, wait a second, what if we did some calculations and changed our calculation of wind to a calculation of energy production for your farm? Wow, that sounds great. So now the scientists go back out. They do a completely different set of research. They get a totally different set of awards for this project. They bring it back to the energy company. They're like, man, this is sweet. They start using it in their day-to-day operations. Saves them $6 or $7 million over a period of 2 years. Okay? So the lesson here, right, is that these kind of latent differences in what we want to get out of a relationship can produce meaningful conflict, right? And it's only once we see them, only once we engage in the conversation necessary to reveal that they're present, that we can come up with something to do with it. Turn it from this science sucks to let's save $5 to $6 million. Okay. So, key takeaways from boundaries. We often have differing values, right, for how we accomplish our goals. These may seem like not a big deal, but they often breed the sorts of politics that are like poison to teams. Okay? The only way, and there's actually quite a bit of literature on this that looks at teams and how teams overcome this. The best way we know of dealing with this is dialogue, communicating, engaging, taking perspective, learning what it means to be an energy company if you're a scientist, and being serious about understanding that. Why? Because it's only once you can speak the language of your partner that you can truly find the common ground necessary to build collaboration. Okay? So we're starting to see how we might use these challenges to build a set of strategies. That's where I want to go next. Okay? What do we do? Farley, you've been yapping at us for 45 minutes, right? What do I do with all this information? Okay? So what should we do? Let's first of all recap what we've learned, as any good university professor will do before giving the punchline. So we started from here, right? This notion that, man, we could just get these ideas together, we could come up with light bulbs, right? We get this idea that we're building people together. I kind of broke that down, and we said it's not about the light bulb, it's more about the workshop. And what you may or may not realize at this point is that I've actually told you how the workshop works. Okay? There are two pieces to what makes Edison's workshop work. The first is connection, right? Creating connections with people who have diverse knowledge from one another, right? That's what creates the potential for these benefits, right? The second thing, though, is dialogue, is overcoming these barriers. We're going to encounter these challenges, and the only way we can do it is by having a deep relationship with one another, and there's really no way around that, okay? A thing that Edison often isn't given credit for is his choice of location for his lab. Menlo Park is not a big town, right? Most of the folks who worked there ate dinner together, went to lunch together, right? They hung out all the time. It's a small town. Not a mistake. In fact, there's some evidence that it was on purpose that he did this, right? The idea is he wanted the folks who were working with and for him to know each other. He at least got it intuitively that having this relationship was an important part of the process. Okay? So, if we're going to build some strategies, we now know what the building blocks of those strategies need to be, right? We need to kind of have diverse connections, but for those connections we need to have dialogue. And so I'm going to give you the advice and show you where most organizations break down. Most organizations get this part. They get the connection thing, right? This is sort of like the first easy step for you to get. Yeah, I kind of get it that if you know something that I don't know, and we can combine those things, then we'll be able to support things. Where organizations fail time and time again, pretty much every organization I've gone in to study this, is in recognizing how important this second part of the process is, right? And this is embedded in how we talk about innovation. This goes back to the light bulb appearing over top of your head, right? In that metaphor is no room for dialogue, right? If it's just something that happens instantaneously, why do I need to dump more resources into allowing you to actually engage with the people you're connecting with, right? Because it should just happen right off the bat. But that's not what our research looking at how these teams actually operate shows us, okay? So taking this in mind, I want to give you a couple of strategies that you might think of using as an individual, so as yourselves trying to build and foster useful cross-boundary relationships. And then I want to talk a little bit about what organizations more broadly can do to try and foster successful cross-disciplinarity in their organizations. First thing has to do with taking dialogue seriously as you engage and approach other people. So here's a quote again from a researcher talking about what annoys them the most when someone tries to seek them out to have a collaboration. They say, usually challenges come from viewing us as a service and undermining our intellectual stake in the situation. When they view us as a service, it puts a ceiling on the level of our collaboration. It gets to the point when they say, okay, it's time for you folks to go home. It's time for the real scientists to take over. Okay? Now, what is happening in this situation? And this happens all the time. And people doing networking and stuff like that, is they'll say, man, you got something cool. I have a great idea. Can you do it for me? Does that sound great? Like a useful strategy? Right? That is the connect and no dialogue strategy. Right? That is the, I assume that you putting work, there's no work involved in you sharing knowledge with me. Right? So sure, yeah, run my analysis for me. Sure, yeah, give me $1 million. You don't need to get anything about it. I just need your money. Right? That's what's going on when all you do is connect, right? So what can we do if we realize that it's not just about finding opportunities, right? It's about fostering these opportunities, is that we can take dialogue seriously. We can recognize that as we're building networks, this is the counterintuitive thing about these brokers, right? Is that you may actually want to foster fewer connections. One of the first responses that I often get when I talk about the social network analysis stuff that I talk to you guys is, okay, so what do? I try and build the broadest network of connections that I can make possible so that I can have access to everything at once. Right? But I've actually done some analyses that show that people who have bigger networks, they tend to have much shallower understandings or engagement with the people that they're connected to, especially people who have different knowledge or expertise from them. Why is this the case? Because you're spending so much time networking, you're not getting to know the people that you're trying to network with, right? And so if you buy this argument that dialogue, that engagement is important, right, your strategy should involve seeking potential opportunities for value across boundaries. But once you find a couple of those, you should take the time to get to know that person, right? And recognize the following things, right? You don't lead with your ask. I have a hunch this may be part of a strategy that many of you know, right? Why don't we lead with the ask? The reason is because you don't know their language yet, right? So the folks, scientists, business folks, engineers that I've studied that are good at this, the first thing they'll do when they approach someone is say, hey, I see the possibility for us to work together. But before I talk about that, I want to know more about what you do, right? Tell me, what would bring you to the table for something like this? And not only are they just being suave kind of negotiators, they're doing something tricky and something that totally helps them overcome the challenges that we're talking about here, right? Is they're recognizing that if they learn the values and language and expertise just a little bit of the person they're trying to work with, that they're going to be much more likely when they get to their ask to be able to frame it in a way that appeals to them. That lets them see, well, you're not just coming to me for a service, right? Wait, I can actually get something out of this. And it's that builds this kind of mutual motivation to keep things going on. What else can we do? We can recognize that conflict is going to happen. You're not going to avoid it. You're going to encounter situations where you don't understand what the person says. You're going to encounter situations where you have differing viewpoints and perspectives. This should not be something that you should be afraid of. It should be something that you are ready and expect to happen as you engage with people, and you should see it as an opportunity. So the incorrect response is walk away. The correct response is, why is this happening? Right? Is there one of these three? What's the driver behind this conflict? Is it that we're just talking about things in different ways? Is it that I don't see the world from their perspective? Is it that we think that we're talking about the same thing, but we're not? Right? So tell me, why are you resisting this at this moment? Okay? And thinking critically about kind of your own perspective and how the way that you're framing your statements to them might not be coming across. You think you're singing happy birthday, they're hearing, right? Okay, and the final thing is, there's skills involved in doing this. This is not like a necessarily easy thing to do. My hunch, given the results of our experiment, is that you're naturally pretty good at it, right? But it's something you can practice. Something you can do today is you can start going out and asking people and trying to get an understanding of what makes them tick, right? And developing a habit of trying to do this when you first meet someone, right? And I'll tell you, as an ethnographer, someone who studies people in context, people love to talk about themselves. So you'll find, if you start practicing this, that it's pretty easy to learn things, right? Not only is this good practice, but it also is a great way for you to try and find and reveal opportunities that may not have appeared to you initially off the bat, right? Because there may be some latent potential there that you didn't realize because you don't have the expertise in the area that they're talking about. Okay, so those are my strategies for individuals, right? Let's talk a little bit about organizations. And I like to pick on organizations because I think they're kind of funny and they don't make a lot of sense, and that's part of why I love them and love studying them, right? And so I'm going to give you a couple of examples that organizations use to foster cross-boundary relationships within them. First, open offices. Anybody work in an open office? Has in the past, maybe? Okay. You know what it is, CubeFarm, right? The logic here often is, well, if we can't let them wall themselves off, they're going to have to talk to each other, right? And there's validity to that statement, right? I've done some work looking at open office environments. Oftentimes, the initial response is, okay, well, exactly how many hours a day do I need to be here, right? Or can I wear headphones while I'm working? Or in extreme cases, can I like steal furniture and build a wall around my cube, right? I've seen it. That actually happened in this particular space, right? So what's going on here? We've built connection. We've built the possibility for connection, but we're not rewarding dialogue. People still think their job is to get their job done, right? They don't think their job is to actually explore opportunities, and more importantly, they're not rewarded for doing so, okay? So that's example one. Example two, expertise directories, okay? LinkedIn is a great example of this, but many organizations use internal knowledge directories like this as a way to try and foster cross-boundary relationships. Again, great idea, right? But only gets the first part of the story. So I'm browsing LinkedIn, I find someone who sounds like they're doing something interesting, I send them a note out of the blue. Do they respond to that note? No, right? Why would they respond to that note? You're Will Barley from University of Illinois, and I'm busy working wherever, right? Why do I need to talk to you, right? Because there's no incentive built into the system to reward people from actually exploring and engaging in these relationships. And more importantly, we often punish folks for doing this, right? We measure people based upon outputs, based upon standardized outputs, right? And engaging in this type of work of building relations, doesn't produce those outputs, at least not in the short term. The argument in the literature would be that if you engage in this over time across a number of relationships, you would produce more outputs, right? But in the short period, it doesn't look like you're doing your work, right? That's a real mistake, because that's super important stuff if you buy that this is how we make innovation happen. Third thing that I've really actually seen organizations do are speed dating events, where you get people who you think should be talking together, you put them in a room like this, and you have them spend a minute talking to each other about their ideas, right? Oh my God, people hate these things. Because the good quote, which I think you've seen enough quotes at this point, is it's like a tease. Right? If you reveal this potential to me, right, but then it's a speed date, right? I get a minute, I go back to my office, I keep doing what I was doing. So what good comes of this? I now know that there's someone who I can't work with who's doing cool stuff on the other side of the building from me, right? So organizations, bless their heart, are getting the first part of the story right, but they often fall short of following up by actually supporting people engaging in these meaningful connections with one another. So I want to give you a couple of examples of what successful organizations who actually have gotten the whole picture right do. Okay? The first thing they do is they realize that we, our organizations, we need to have a culture that actually values dialogue. Okay? And we need to explore opportunities, and we need to reward our employees for doing so. Okay? So the reason there's a bell here is that there's another kind of classic example of an innovative company, IDEO. It's a product design firm. They'd have a lot of cool, quirky things that they do, but one of the things they do to try and foster people exploring opportunities when they emerge is they have bells, and anytime someone shuts down a potential opportunity, they ring the bell. Okay? This is sneakily very smart, right? Because what's going on here is you are engaging in very Pavlovian kind of response thing, right? Trying to seed this value for not shutting down opportunities when they present themselves. And if you get management doing this, now you're demonstrating to your employees that this is something that we value as an organization, and that leads employees to think, okay, well, this is something I would do a little bit more, right? Okay. So realizing that it's not just about connection, we actually have to have a culture that supports and rewards this. Speaking about rewards, remember how I told you this takes time, right? Time and money are often very kind of closely tied within organizations, right? The organizations that do this well put their money where their mouth is, right? So what is it, the Google 20% rule or something like that that was kind of big in the news, right? We are going to give you 20% of your time to do what you think is the best for furthering the goals of our organization. That's a pretty sharp idea, right? Because in particular, again, I study scientists, right? If your job is to work on a particular project or grant, and you need to fill out a timesheet, a bill sheet that accounts for all of your hours, right? How do I write up time that I spent exploring a potential opportunity with someone who's not working on a project that I work on that I think could lead to something interesting, but it didn't really produce anything? I'm not going to get paid for it. I'm not going to do it, right? So you need to actually put resources here to support this sort of dialogic process. And the final thing, the organizations that do this well, is they realize that it's hard, and it's not something you learn to do in school. I've heard this from a number of folks on teams, is that this is stuff you learn on the job, right? So the smart organizations that are trying to foster this pair up newcomers with old timers. And they go in the field, and they go on calls together, right? And they learn what are the tricks, what are the tips that you know, that knowledge that you have about building cross-boundary relationships that I don't quite have yet, right? Another thing they'll do is they'll have rotation processes, right? Where they'll say, okay, yeah, you work in R&D, but you're going to spend 6 months hanging out with engineers, right? And I don't care that you don't know about engineering. You're going to be working on cars, right? And the reason for this is smart, right? You're building some at least initial knowledge of the language, values, and expertise of potential collaborators. And you're investing in people developing that under the expectation that it will help you lead to some value down the line. Okay. So that's what I've got. That's kind of what I've got for you today. What I thought would be kind of a cool way for us to finish would be to kind of practice a little bit, right? So I've been sitting up here talking to you about dialogue, and you haven't said a thing, right? So there's no dialogue going on in the room. What I'd like to do for a few minutes, we have about 10 minutes, is have you guys get in, just stay at the tables where you're at, or go and join a bigger group, and have a discussion, right? And ask yourselves, does this guy make sense, right? Do you guys actually face this sort of stuff? As you go about your jobs? What about your job involves kind of building these relationships? Have you encountered these types of challenges? Everybody, I want you to say, my hunch is that you all do. So I also want you to say one thing you have done to manage these relationships, right? And then where I would like you to get to at the end is think about it, have a discussion, right? Is there something that you could do differently as a result of kind of understanding these types of challenges? Or that an organization that you know of might want to do differently if they want to put their money where their mouth is, right? And the reason I'm having you do this is a couple reasons. One, the strategies here are very specific. They need to be kind of tailored to the organization you're in, right? But also to recognize that talking about this stuff actually helps us get better at it, okay? So we're going to take about 10 minutes for that. I'll float around the room. And then afterward, I'll come back up, and we'll kind of share some ideas. I'll also just address open questions from there, okay? So go ahead and chat. I can tell you all love each other a lot, and you don't get to see each other every day. So I apologize for bringing you all back together, but I think there's some really good discussion going on at your tables, and I'd like to see if we can bring out some themes that might have been coming up in your conversations. I've certainly heard connections among the conversations I heard. I'm also more than happy to take clarifying questions or just stuff you have about my talk. I'd be happy to answer that. So who has something they want to ask or say? I was told you guys like to talk. Yeah. Sure. Mm-hmm.
That being a time-sensitive barrier and not knowing what the phone is when to send an email and what's appropriate and how do people like to operate. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious your
I can give you a good book. So I make all of my undergrad students read a book called Send, Why People Email So Badly and How to Do It Better. It's a cute book, but it talks about kind of the challenges that we face as we try and manage relationships over email. It's a very limiting medium, right? And it's quite hard to develop a deep relationship with someone over this. So oftentimes, if you feel like you're not getting someone over email, it's old-fashioned, but man, it works so much better just to make that call, right? And do it like 4 or 5 days sooner than you think you should. You often find that progress will happen faster than that. So that's my thought on email in 2 minutes or a minute. What else? Yeah.
In your example about the engineers using together to design for the car,
Yep.
you thought about how it would be different if they all came to consensus about what the perfect car is before going into the meeting. So they can say, we want it to weigh this much, and with the safety rating do this, and then going to the meeting with expectations. You thought about, have you done any studies of that at all?
So this is exactly what the companies try to do, right? What they don't realize, what the kind of challenge of doing what you're saying, right, is assuming that there is a perfect car. That there would be a car that would be the safest, the lightest, the least noisy, fastest, most fuel efficient. They're just opposing ideals within these kind of areas, right? And so oftentimes, they will set these benchmarks. Right? And they'll use quantitative things like say, okay, well, we need to get this rating in a safety crash test, and we want it to be like library quiet is a term that's used a lot inside the car, right? But what they find out is that you're not going to meet all of these goals at once, and so it really does come down to these negotiations, right? Where are we going to cut? And so you just need to expect that that's going to happen. Doing stuff like that up front helps, right? Because it gives you a point of reference to base your argument upon, but recognizing that no metric you set up front is going to be perfect until you realize where it's broken, right? That you're not going to be able to manage it. But good idea. Yeah. What are the thoughts or questions? Yes.
We discussed about organizationally how it's really, really important, and I'm not sure that we're actually getting what we need in relation to incentivization and reward for collaboration.
Yeah.
So until that equals the amount of effort that we put into
Right.
the first step,
Yeah.
it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah. So this is one. I was sitting with you guys when you were talking about this. I was sitting with a couple of other groups who were talking about very similar things. This is a thing I hear all the time, right? About organizations that unwittingly disincentivize cross-boundary relationships. Because it comes down to credit, right? If I work with you and help you close a deal, but that deal goes to your organization, what do I get out of this, right? From this perspective, from the argument I'm saying today, that you are being involved in that relationship is super valuable, right? But the way that organizations often measure and reward productivity is that they'll give the member of the collaboration who is within the receiving unit the credit, and then the other person not. And the challenge with that is that, sure, okay, you do that maybe once or twice, but you got to, make your year-end report, right? If you don't figure out a way and to kind of level or figure out a way to incentivize the assist, it was an analogy, I think, basketball analogy that was used, right? Then you end up unwittingly disincentivizing this whole process, right? This is what I mean. This is tricky stuff. But it's once you start to think about kind of, at least we have some of the language now to talk about why it's hard for us to do this. Other thoughts? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Happen? Sure. So the question is, do co-working spaces work, right, effectively, right? The short answer is no, I've not studied them. The kind of speculation is that they probably don't work as well as advertised. Because think about it, right? Why are people going to co-worker space? What is your incentive to go there? To get your work done, right? Are you going to go there and like chat it up with other people? Maybe a little bit, right? This is the open office logic, right? That if we put people together, they're going to innovate, right? But if we put people together and they're still incentivized to do their own work, they're probably not going to interact as much as they would. This is not backed up by data. It's backed up by my speculation based upon previous research. But that's my hunch. Be a cool study. What else? Yeah.
About onboarding,
Mm-hmm.
and all the way from the university down to the unit,
Mhm.
and how it's a great opportunity to really create some cross-cultural connections right away.
Yeah.
Right, how there's a lot of different movement going on. And also how coming with new eyes allows you to look for those connections and
Mhm.
ask those questions
Mhm.
very quickly before you're tasks.
Yeah.
Right.
Not allowed.
Right.
Right.
That is an idealized
Yes.
situation. Right.
So socialization is the term that we use to talk about, say, to study onboarding in organizational studies, right? This is kind of like a really magical moment in organizations. One, because you are learning, right? And it's kind of a time where you get to know the culture of an organization, right? But it also is weirdly the time when you have the most opportunity to enact change, right? Because if you're a newcomer, you have the excuse of, hey, I'm new here, I have no clue what's going on. Can you tell me what you do, right? Oh, hey, what do those people do? I'm probably in the wrong place. Like, what are you guys doing over here, right? So you have this like newbie thing that you lose. You don't get that license when you've been someplace for 10 years. So I think you're onto a good hunch that this would be a good place if you were to initiate some sort of strategies here where you could kind of get this right off the bat, right? And enact change not just with newcomers, but also with the old timers in the organization as well. So cool idea. Anything else? All right. Well, it's been a pleasure. It's very nice meeting you. My contact information should be on the next slide. Doot. Cool. I'd be happy to chat with any of you if any of this resonated, or if anything didn't make any sense at all, let me know too, because I'm always interested in that. So thanks.